Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. Don't forget to check out my Substack, which I started 2 weeks ago. Also, you can support me directly and engage with the channel on Locals, and you can support me on Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribestar. Also, as for the last month or so now, I've been having my thumbnails done by Censored Anon. Does great work. Check him out. His contact information is in the low bar. So, we have in the chat Jonathan Pohl, Cyber Ninja Zero, Al Harrison, Jorge Punta, and Manoan. Hello. So, as I mentioned in the description of today's episode 35 of the Casual Stream was where I discussed Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Not necessarily the book that Sutton wrote, which you should all read. It's a great introduction to the topic, and I read from parts of it. But also the broader claim that he makes, which is also echoed by people like G. Edward Griffin from The Creature from Jekyll Island, in fact, indebted to Sutton's research, and the like. And of course, just if you know where to find the original primary sources, just some of the weird places you can find it, like U.S. congressional hearings, where I read a portion of the testimony by Raymond Robbins. Now, one of the things we've heard about a lot, and somebody mentioned in the comments of that video during the live chat, that infrared, among others, and many will argue, well, Sutton's work just isn't reputable. Which, one, that's just complete bollocks, and that's why this is going to be done. Second of all, his work has never been, it has been addressed, but it hasn't been addressed for a very long time. But here's what's important, right? When it was addressed by scholars in the field, what was their understanding of his work? Nobody questioned his methodology. Nobody questioned the facts of the matter. If there was any questions at all, it was certain conclusions that he drew, which, in light of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, were correct. And we'll get into that over the succeeding episodes. This is what's important, right? So Antony Sutton, working for the Hoover Institute, in 1968, published his seminal Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1917 to 1930. In 1971, he published Western Technology and Soviet Technical Development, 1930 to 1945. And in 1973, he published Western Technology and Soviet Technical Development, 1945 to 1965. Now, years ago, when I was still going to college and I had access to JSTOR for free, I looked up all the scholarly reviews of these three books. And I printed them out, and I don't know where I put them at this point. But I had a friend who's also still in school who downloaded for me all the PDFs. I have them in a Google Drive, which I will share after the stream is over, and I will be reading from during the stream. This is about 29 articles. It's almost 30 articles. So I won't be able to read them all in one episode. But as I've said before, people might not read what I recommend, but they will watch me read it. And this is extremely important for me, and I think for anybody that wants to have a correct understanding of the 20th century. The fact that Wall Street supported the Soviet Union, and just more broadly, the Western business class supported the Soviet Union throughout almost in its entire history, completely forces us to rewrite our understanding of the 20th century, especially the Cold War. Things get a lot messier and a lot more difficult to understand. Now, the long and the short of it is, I think the best way to understand all this is the idea of the scientific and technocratic elite. You have Carroll Quigley in his work talking about the roundtables, the Milner Group, things like that. You have, of course, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, and Aldous Huxley talking about scientific dictatorship. I will, of course, eventually talk about all those people as well, and this sort of cabal of technocrats and financiers going back to Rhodes in the 1880s and 90s. But for now, we're just going to deal with Sutton's key insights in the technical transfers from Western technology to the Soviet Union, and what was the opinion of scholars at the time. So, beginning with the review by Joseph S. Berliner, Journal of Economic Literature, Volume 8, Number 3, September 1970. All right, let's see. Technology is a major factor in economic development. Soviet technology in the period 1917 to 30 originated in the West and not in the Soviet Union. The Western contribution was therefore decisive in Soviet economic development during this period. This is the thesis of Antony Sutton's book. He takes issue with various economists who have assigned a minor role to foreign concessions in Soviet development during this period. In support of his thesis, he has compiled a great volume of detailed information on 339 concessions. Most of the books consist of an industry-by-industry survey of these foreign technology. In the final chapter, he summarizes the evidence and concludes that the penetration of the technology was complete. At least 95% of the industrial structure received this assistance. The expression at least 95% does not signify that the results are expressed in quantitative form, and this indeed is the major difficulty in evaluating Sutton's results. Massive detail on industrial concessions creates an impression of extensive penetration by foreign equipment and technical personnel into the Soviet economy. But qualitative evidence cannot be used to sustain this thesis that foreign technology was decisive. What are required are aggregate measures which would provide a basis for judging the size and impact of the foreign contributions relative to the total national economy. The author does provide two sets of quasi-quantitative summaries that may satisfy the favorably disposed reader, but they would hardly convince the skeptic. In one set of summary tables, 20-1 through 20-5, he shows that in 43 of the 44 two-digit SIC sectors, some kind of foreign contribution can be identified. This is the source of the statement that at least 95% of the industrial economy received some kind of foreign assistance. The tabulation is make clear that the program of concessions and technical assistance agreements was widely employed throughout the industrial economy, but does not tell us how large the impact was in each of the many sectors in which it was employed. In the second summary tabulation, 20-6, the author addresses himself to the question by ranking the impact of Western technology on the 100 technical activities examined in the text. The ranking is based on a 5-point scale according to the degree of identifiable technological associations between Western firms and Soviet institutions. The scale ranges from complete, 80% of all new capacity, to none, 0 to 20% of all new capacity. In 79 of the 100 activities, the impact is ranked as heavily or complete. The ranking appears to be biased on the author's subjective judgment of the evidence, and very little detail is provided. For example, the foreign impact is in the production of accumulators is ranked as complete. If one searches for the basis of this judgment, one finds a one-paragraph exposition in the text, page 197, which reports that A, the accumulated trust produced 0.6 million rubles of output in 1922-23. B, one of the trust plants was leased in December 1924. C, the firm was required to re-equip the plant and to produce an output rising from 0.2 million rubles in the first year to 0.5 million rubles in 1926-27. The skeptical reader is entitled to question the judgment that this evidence supports the conclusion that the foreign impact on the industry was complete. The thesis that the foreign technical contribution was decisive requires a genuinely comparative body of evidence, which the author does not prove. There are no data on capital good imports as a percentage of percentage of total capital goods invested, or on foreign technical and managerial inputs as a percentage of total technical and managerial inputs. But even such data would be difficult to relate to the central thesis, for the author uses the term decisive in an impressionistic way. He does not tell us how large a technical contribution must be in order that it be decisive. Perhaps he was wise not to try, because it may not be a manageable question. It is probably more instructive to regard the relation between technology transfer and economic development as a continuous and monotonic relation, particularly for the underdeveloped country. Although problems of absorptive capacity may cause the curve to level off and perhaps even decline beyond some range. Viewed in this light, the evidence Mr. Sutton has painstakingly compiled may be interpreted in a way quite different from what that he intended. It portrays an underdeveloped country whose leadership performed the remarkable feat of attracting, financing, and absorbing greater, we don't know this, it would have been interesting if the author provided comparative data, inflow of foreign technology than had ever been achieved before by any underdeveloped country. The author may not quarrel with this interpretation, for his main point lies elsewhere. The collapse of the economy under war communism was due to the Civil War, but was not due to the Civil War, but to the dispersion of skills, absurd decrees, and the removal of disciplinary market forces. NEP was a temporary move to utilize the knowledge and experience of the capitalist class to revive the economy. But it too threatened to founder because of political interference in the decision-making. In face of these failures, complete reliance was placed on Western help. An author is entitled to interpret his own work, and Mr. Sutton chooses to interpret the heavy Western technological contribution to Soviet developments as evidence of the failure of the Bolsheviks to develop an indigenous technology. But other plausible interpretation is that the book is not about an unsuccessful communist party, but about a successful underdeveloped country. So what's interesting about this interpretation here is, again, Joseph S. Berliner is not questioning the facts acquired by Sutton, but a certain interpretation that he provides. And again, that's what you're going to see from most of the people that push back on Sutton. There are those that don't. Now, we all have the luxury of looking back and seeing the collapse of the Soviet Union in the rearview mirror, and his broader economic claims about the Soviet Union being a captive market for the West and unable to develop. So, for example, during the 80s, with Reagan's military buildup, you had Star Wars, you had the computerization of communications and guidance systems, cruise missiles, and all sorts of advanced military technology that the Soviet Union largely wasn't able to keep up with. So again, these reviews are in the 70s and onward, when the Soviet Union was still a legitimate threat and a powerful opponent to Western forces. So there's going to be a large body of academics that are going to push back on this and be like, well, okay, we might accept your reading, we might accept your data collection methods, we're just going to disagree with your interpretation. Okay. Next one is Olga Crisp, The Economic Journal, Volume 81, number 322, June 1971. This is the first part of a 3-volume work in progress of the role of Western technology in Soviet industrialization process. Sutton maintains that the Soviet Union had inherited from Imperial Russia a viable industrial structure with evidence of indigenous technology in the automobile and aviation industries and turbines, chemicals, and railway equipment. He argues further that neither the 1914 war nor the revolution have negatively affected the industrial structure in any significant way. Indeed, by 1917, after some dislocation in the first year of the war, the index of industrial output in many essential sectors stood above its 1913 level. He ascribes the catastrophic state of the Russian industry and the economy in general by 1921-22 to the ineptitude of Bolshevik leaders, the dispersal of skilled workers and management consequent upon the total removal of the discipline of the market, and the bizarre notions about the workings of an economic system as implemented under war communism, 1918-21. With a few notable exceptions, industrial equipment was in a state of technological preservation and just needed able management and people with know-how to set it working. In a number of sectors, the machinery was outdated, for the technological equipment was primitive, and substitution for modern technology was needed to speed up production. It is Sutton's thesis that the catastrophic decline of 1922 was arrested by 1924, and if expansion of industrial production followed, it was owing entirely to the massive transfers of technology, managerial ability, and labor skills from Western Europe and the United States, consequent upon the policy of concessions initiated by the Soviet Union in 1921, and in particular after the Russo-German Treaty of Rapallo. It has been commonly assumed that the policy of concessions to Western private business was largely ineffective, and that consequently Soviet success in industry was entirely the result of the unaided effort of the Soviet people and of specific policies and ideology. These assumptions were partly due to lack of information and partly due to the general tendency to judge the effectiveness of concessions from the point of view of capital investment rather than as a vehicle for the transfer of technology in the broadest sense, employing skills and scientific know-how in addition to the actual importation of equipment. Sutton, using United States and German archives materials supplemented by a variety of printed sources, fully documents industry by industry how the concessions enabled the Soviet Union to acquire cheaply without cost of research and development much that was the latest in technology, mainly from the United States and Germany, but also from other countries if they happened to be leaders in a particular process, often within years of its adoption, and often ahead of the rest of Europe. Up to about 1926, the emphasis was on the pure concession or the mixed joint stock company. After that date, the concession was replaced by technical assistance contracts and the importation of complete plants and equipment, which also coincide with the growing predominance of United States business over all other Western firms. After the acquisition of a specific technology by either concession, purchase, or confiscation, came duplication in Soviet plants. Major acquisitions were supplemented by the purchase or appropriation of designs, patents, and prototypes, the Soviet government taking advantage of the gullibility of and the competition between Western firms. Technological acquisitions were implemented, supervised, and imparted by Western engineers and experts, while Soviet engineers and workers were simultaneously sent for training in foreign plants. At one time, 2,000 German technicians were known to have been employed in the Soviet industry, and directors of Western firms were on occasion on the board of Soviet industrial trusts. By using the standard industrial classification, Sutton examines the sectorial impact of foreign concessions and concludes that of a total of 43 sectors, 84%, had received concessions and transfer of Western skills and technology, and that in the majority of these, the impact of Western technology was either complete or heavy, i.e. involving over 60% of new capacity. There is no denying the importance of Sutton's findings, not only for the Soviet specialist who may have to revise his views of Soviet industrialization process, but also to the student of growth economics. However, in his effort to address this balance, Sutton may have gone too far in discounting the Soviet achievement. Occasionally, this lands him in contradictions, in that in emphasizing the clever use of foreign trade monopoly, or the trustification of industry, or the insistence of Soviet trusts, directors on particular process, or the increased circulation of foreign scientific and technical journals, he pays an unconscious tribute to the Soviet leaders' economic policy. Furthermore, he touches on a very superficially upon various economic measures of Soviet government in the sphere of agricultural policy, trade, monetary reform, and finance, which, if not the only determinants of the restoration and subsequent expansion of Soviet industry, were undoubtedly indispensable for the return to a more or less stable economic life, without which the concessions and the revival of foreign trade would have been unthinkable. On the other hand, it is true to say that the concessions in the oil, timber, furs, and dairy industries secured for the Soviet Union valuable foreign exchanges for the purchase of foreign equipment, though Sutton seems to have misinterpreted the import figures by overestimating the proportion of capital goods import in the total. So here, this author seems to have less umbrage with his complete heavy distinction of 84%. And again, it's the similar, we're not going to argue with the data collected. That's fine. The evidence is fine. We're going to argue about how we interpret the data. And again, this is in the 70s, so the Soviet Union had not yet fallen. Now, what I will say briefly before I go on to the next thing is it's pretty clear that at no point in the Cold War did the Soviet Union ever achieve a military innovation over the United States, seriously, except maybe in a few military missile technologies at the end. So, for example, at the end of the Cold War, you had the Oscar submarine that could fire cruise missiles from underwater. You have the supersonic Sunbird anti-ship missile. And, compare that to the mid-20th century Germans, who invented a whole galaxy of weapons, again, too late in the war to have an effect, but before the U.S. was able to develop them. So there's clearly a fundamental difference in the ability of the Soviet Union to innovate, and especially during World War II, like they were behind on every metric. The Germans had better everything than the Russians. The Russians could just produce more. So, again, in hindsight, I'm not convinced by some of these objections, but okay. Michael R. Dohan, Slavic Review, Volume 29, Number 2, June 1970. This book is the first detailed study of large-scale infusion of Western technology and technical personnel into the Soviet economy during the 1920s. The study's major strength is in its empirical findings. Unfortunately, the analysis of the data is often weak, and several important questions are not raised. Part 1 contains a systematic review for each economic sector of the important commercial contracts involving identifiable technical associations, concluded with Western firms or experts during the 1920s. The author's sources include the State Department's decimal file, German Foreign Ministry records, and numerous company archives and Soviet journals. Sutton focuses his discussion on two important commercial institutions employed by the Soviet government to mobilize Western technology and technical skills: concessions to foreign equity capital for direct investment, and technical assistance concessions for Western blueprints and technical data. Consulting, designing, and management. He also considers several less important mechanisms for transferring technology into the USSR, such as immigration of skilled workers, secret contracts with Germany for military research, development and production in the USSR, and the production of breeding stock, hybrid seeds, and modern equipment. By collecting scattered, formerly inaccessible data and shaping it into a reasonably complete history of Western technologies and skills in the Soviet economy of the 1920s, Sutton has produced the first study to show that the Soviet program for utilizing these technologies and skills was much larger, more widespread throughout the country, and more important to Soviet recovery in the 1920s than is commonly believed. The Soviet experience indicates that technical skills and technology can be obtained from private foreign enterprises without being accompanied by the use of foreign private capital, and illustrates the importance of government in accelerating the transfer of technology into backward sectors. Okay, before I continue reading this, there's a couple points I want to make out here. So far, nobody's arguing with the data collection. So why is it that for all of our lives, we've heard that the Soviet Union industrialized under the power of socialism from Western media outlets? Very interesting question. I wouldn't have heard about this except for Kerry Bolton. And so again, props to Kerry Bolton. He's one of those guys you have to read. Revolution from Above is a great introduction to all of this. Second of all, I think we have a motive explanation for why this got suppressed by the corporate media. I'll read this again. Soviet experience indicates that technical skills and technology can be obtained from private foreign enterprises without being accompanied by the use of foreign private capital, and illustrates the importance of government in accelerating the transfer of technology into backward sectors. Well, beginning in the 80s, the hollowing out of American industry to China was going on. This is the second iteration of what we saw in the 20s and 30s. Something that was kept very well hidden in secret. It was now done in the light of day in the 80s and 90s and 2000s with China. And I think if people had been aware that, so the China angle was, if we industrialize and trade with China, they'll liberalize and they'll trade with us. They knew full well that wasn't true, because they did that with the Soviets and it didn't work. If this knowledge were more widely disseminated, it would have been, I think, much harder for them to transfer capital to China. That's I think, one reason why we can see this was suppressed. In part 2, the author attempts to assess the overall effect of foreign concessions and technical assistance on Soviet economic development. The analysis and conclusions of this part show an incomplete grasp of Soviet foreign trade and economic history, and a failure to apply the data to several key questions relating to the importance of transferred technology. Sutton's major hypothesis that Western technological aid was the single most important source of Soviet economic development during the 1920s is improperly formulated and unsubstantiated. Western technological assistance was undeniably an important element in restoring output in several sectors: petroleum, transportation, mining. But to apply generalizations based on a few sectors to the entire economy has no analytical or empirical justification. In particular, Sutton, heavily influenced by recent studies of the importance of technological progress and economic growth, fails to discuss other important factors such as the powerful market forces of the NEP and expansionary economic policies. Certainly, Sutton is correct in concluding that Soviet modernization, technological innovation, and investment in the 1920s were almost entirely based on Western rather than Soviet technology and technical skills. Sutton implies, however, that Soviet technological dependence is a reflection of inherent weakness in the socialist system. But Sutton studies overlooks the widespread importance of Western technology in the pre-1907 Russian economy. In contrast with Sutton's view, an alternative hypothesis worthy of investigation is that a large Soviet program to utilize Western technology in the 1920s reflected the capability of a relatively backward socialist economy to accelerate the transfer and assimilation of advanced technology. And we're going to see this a lot because, again, and as now, there's a lot of socialist academics. And for Sutton to make these claims before the fall of the Soviet Union was an extremely bold claim to make. And I think it's interesting that while there is some pushback on that particular claim, that a fundamental weakness of socialist planning, they can't ultimately argue with the data collection. And for my purposes, that's the important thing here, right? Though I tend to agree with Sutton's view that socialism can't innovate, at least not communist socialism. What I'm really interested in is the Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution and built it from the ground up, economic brick by economic brick. And this is the real meat of the proof. Sutton's analysis of sectoral impact on Western technology has several shortcomings. Although Western aid was undoubtedly widespread throughout the economy, The conclusion that it was used in 90 to 98% of the economy is highly dependent on the sectorial classification system used, and in this case implies a much greater effect on output and investment than would be the case if the estimate were based on some more relevant measure, such as value of output or investment production with some form of Western aid. Although no sectorial or aggregate estimates of Soviet expenditure on Western technical assistance are made, Sutton's data suggests that on the basis of output and capital investment, Soviet industry, heavy industry, mining, metallurgy, metalworking, etc., most likely spent a disproportionately large portion of their funds compared to the consumer good industries and agriculture. The study shows that the Soviet concessions involving foreign equity capital usually ended in expropriation or other failure of reasons often not spelled out by Sutton. Sutton asserts that this fate of foreign capital in the USSR was largely the result of bad faith on the part of the Soviet government. This hypothesis needs more documentation. A systematic review of the operation and termination of Soviet concessions might provide some insights into the causes of mutual disillusionment about the concessions policy and into the problems of private foreign enterprises operating in socialist and increasingly centralized economy. It is to be hoped that in the 2 future volumes promised by Sutton, some of these issues may be dealt with. Despite the criticisms above, Sutton's book is of value to students of the Soviet economy and of technological innovation and economic development, for the study contains a great deal of interesting data and provides several insights into Soviet growth and the process of technological transfer. Okay. Who's the... Okay, Egmont Institute. Okay. Wow. Oh, it's in French. I can't read that, guys. All right. Where were we going to go? Yeah, Feinstein. C.H. Feinstein, The Journal of Economic History, Volume 29, Number 4, December 1969. Sutton's primary objective was to estimate in a quantitative manner the impact of Western technology on early Soviet economic development. And he concludes from his study that Soviet technology was completely dependent on the West in the decade of the 1920s. To ascertain this, he has examined a vast amount of information, much of it previously unknown to scholars, regarding the trading contacts and contracts between the USSR and the West, notably Germany and the United States. The primary sources were the fascinating and extraordinary detailed files of the U.S. State Department and the archives of the German Foreign Ministry, and these were supplemented by wide-ranging and multilingual sections of books and journals. Each of the trading links and concessions discovered is carefully listed and described sector by sector, with a distinction drawn between those involving actual participation by foreign capital and or labor, including management, and those in which the Soviet Union simply purchased patents, designs, etc. The final chapters discuss the significance of these foreign concessions and the associated technological transfers. Sutton's prodigious researches, and this is apparently only the first of 3 projected volumes, have provided students of Soviet economic development with a detailed survey of the way in which Western technology was transferred to the Soviet Union, and for this we are indebted to him. Unfortunately, he attempts to go beyond this, and to assess the significance of this transfer and of the concessions policy is unsatisfactory and overstates the extent and impact of the concessions, as well as the importance for Soviet economic development. Previous writers, including those of the U.S. State Department, are assailed for regarding concessions as of little importance. For example, A. Bykov, The Development of the Soviet Economic System, Cambridge 1946, is accused of failing to mention them. In fact, Bykov not only mentions concessions, but also calculates that the output of concessionary industry was only 0.4% of the total gross output of large-scale industry in 1925-26, and still less in 1926-27. And that companies granted concessions in the sphere of foreign trade accounted for between 3 and 4% of total foreign trade turnover in the mid-1920s. Although during the first years, the role of these companies as regarded certain highly profitable export goods was very significant, this picture of very low overall importance but of significance in key sectors is almost certainly much nearer the mark than that given by Sutton, whose attempts to prove a quantitative assessment of the impact of foreign concessions consists of tables showing that 98% of Soviet industries classified on the basis of the U.S. Standard Industrial Classification had at least one concession. He regards this counting by number of concessions as an overwhelming demonstration of the importance, even though his own studies show that many of these listed were relatively trivial, and he frequently refers solely to the obligations specified in the original contract, even though the actual performance must surely have turned out to be rather different in many cases. It is also notable that he omits any statistics of imports, although one might have expected this to be used as a relevant indicator of the extent to which foreign equipment, not technology, was applied. Perhaps the most damning criticism is his implicit assumption that all that mattered was the transfer of advanced technology. Only one paragraph is devoted to the serious problems of adapting the imported technology to Russian conditions. By contrast, Granick's recent book on the Soviet metal fabricating economic development Wisconsin 1967 contains an illuminating discussion of this issue and exposes very clearly the defects in Sutton's approach. Granick argues on the basis of detailed study of individual plants that even in these factories, which were most directly based on Western technology, and in which aid from foreign companies was greatest, the need for small changes and innovations culminated in the necessity for a massive technical effort. Routine acceptance of the details of foreign technology was impractical. A similar lack of understanding of the real economic issues vitiates Sutton's other main proposition. As technology in the period between 1917 and 1930 originated in the West and not in the Soviet Union, the Western contribution was decisive in Soviet economic development during this period. He acknowledges in a phrase that non-economic forces also play a part, but no other economic factors are accorded even passing consideration as of relevance to an evaluation of Soviet economic development. If the transfer of advanced technology at low cost is really all that is required, it is a matter of some difficulty to understand why the world still contains so many underdeveloped countries. Since it seems for once appropriate to end a review on a critical note, may I also add Sutton exaggerates the extent of pre-Soviet development. See, for example, his choice of 1901 as a reference date for pre-1917 output of crude oil, thus concealing the fact that the output in 1913 was some 20% lower. Or his bizarre claim that the aircraft development and construction had made vigorous progress in Tsarist Russia. He further indulges his fondness of exaggeration with such statements as, the Soviet Union, supposedly the opponent of monopoly, has in fact become the greatest recipient of monopolistic profits in the history of industrialized society. And he attempts to refute propositions by Dobb, Holzman, and others regarding the small amount of long-term foreign capital advanced to Soviet Russia by quoting examples of the availability of short-term trade credit. Now, I don't know when we're going to get to this, but I do remember there was another journal entry that supported Sutton's reading of Tsarist industrial development. So again, we got like 12 from this first one to read. So I don't know if we'll get to it today. This is also in French. Yes, it is. Can't read that either then. Let's go back. Hunter. Holland Hunter, The Journal of Developing Areas, July 1916, Volume 3, Number 4, July 1969. This is an important and interesting book. The author has painstakingly assembled details concerning several hundred instances of early Soviet importation of Western technology through concessions, technical assistance agreements, and other channels. He demonstrates the major role these transfers played in reviving the economy after 1921 and launching the plan era at the end of the 1920s. After a brief introduction, 15 chapters describe technology importations in specific sectors during the 1920s. The 6 sectors of Part 2 then is evidently to be followed by 2 more on post-1930 developments. Ample references to primary sources are provided. The study draws heavily on U.S. State Department files and includes reports from Riga and elsewhere, together with a wide variety of other sources consulted in order to verify details. Strong political passions surrounding these transactions, but Sutton generally maintains a dispassionate stance. Students of the USSR will find, however, that he faithfully transmits from his Western sources the curious transliterations of Western names that prevailed 40 years ago. Students of developing areas can learn much from this book. It effectively dispels any notion, for example, that the Bolsheviks began with a backward agricultural economy and promptly, through their own unaided efforts, built an efficient modern economy. It demonstrates the difficulties, suspicious misunderstandings, and cross-purposes that plagued Soviet-Western relations in the 1920s. Finally, it can provoke interesting reflections on the implications of the record for present and future relations between the less developed economies of the Third World and developed economies, both Western and communist. Perhaps the trend that Sutton found for the USSR in the 1920s, from investment in concessions to technical assistance contracts and other software arrangements will prove to be a worldwide phenomenon. Hunter. Okay, Lieberman. Now here, this one is interesting. Lieberman's reading the first two reviews, and so the only other Samuel Lieberman is for 1945, 1965. So we're going to get a little bit of a taste of his future one reading this. Samuel Lieberstein, Technology and Culture, Volume 14, Number 1, January 1973. Antony Sutton's work marks a restructuring of the cognitive field of Soviet studies. Relatively little attention has been given to the problem of technical assimilation in the Soviet Union, although the two volumes under review do not develop this theme in all of its social, political, and ideological ramifications. They do deal with the absorption of Western technology in various industrial fields by Soviet Russia during the years 1917 to 45. The author pursues a strong thesis through his work, one with which it is easy to quarrel, but which provides a rationale for ordering a vast body of material gleaned from the State Department, German Foreign Office, and Wehrmacht files. Briefly stated, it is that without Western technological aid, the Soviet Union could not have developed a viable national economy. Implicit in this thesis is the view that technological advance, in contrast with capital investment, has been an underrated factor in economic development. The Soviet state benefited inordinately, not by foreign investment after 1917, but rather by the import of Western technology and its copying. In discussing the procedures of technical transfer from west to east, the author readily admits that technology was not the only factor in Soviet economic development. Political, social, and psychological factors played their respective roles in this process, but these aspects of Soviet economic advance were outside the scope of his study, which is mainly concerned with the nature of the technical processes transferred to the Soviet Union. With great effectiveness, the author traces the transfer of advanced Western technology in such leading industrial fields as oil and gasoline production, metallurgy, machine and electrical equipment, and a host of others to the Soviet state. Between 1917 and 1930, the major form of this transfer was the concessions agreement. During this period, the Soviets concentrated on acquiring new Western processes, training cadres of politically reliable engineers, and establishing numerous basic and applied research institutions. This process of technical transfer received a strong assistance from the German Trade Agreement of 1921 and the Rapallo Economic, Military, and Trade Protocols. German technical assistance, however, was sharply reduced during the period of the first five-year plan, 1928 to 32, because of the OGPU's fears of the security danger to the Soviet state implied in the massive infiltration and influence of German specialists in Soviet industry. The tendency at the end of the 20s was to turn to the United States for technical help. The second volume of Sutton's study deals with the period of 1930 to 1945. During this era, concessions were replaced by technical assistance agreements, which became the main vehicle for technical transfer. Such agreements were signed mainly with United States firms, which played a major role in providing technical equipment assistance know-how for the first 5-year plan. This move from German to American technology was partially dictated by the probability that American engineers were less likely to get entangled in the meshes of counter-revolution, which had its origins in Europe rather than the United States. The extent of this technical assistance in the period of the 5-year plan can be seen in the case of restoration of Soviet iron and steel industry between 1927 and 1932. Responsibility for the direct transfer of modern technologies to the Soviet Union's iron and steel industry belonged to Gip Romez, State of All Union Institute for Planning of Metallurgical Works, and the Frein Engineering Company of Chicago. Irons and steel plant construction and reconstruction during the period were of American design were built under the supervision of American and some German engineers, utilizing imported equipment from either the United States or Germany, but usually manufactured to American design. The first 5-year plan thus witnessed the massive infusion of foreign technology, foreign engineers, and foreign equipment, most of American origin, into the Soviet Union. Although most of these engineers were to leave by the mid-1932, they had left behind standard designs based on Western models and enormous manufacturing capacity. The rest of the decade was required by the Soviets to master these new processes, install all the equipment, train workers, and expand operations. In conclusion, one cannot but be impressed with the enormous amount of data unearthed by the author in Western archives dealing with the process of technical transfer by Western firms to the Soviet Union. Even if one disagrees with some of his conclusions regarding the almost total dependency of the Soviet Union on import of Western technology, one cannot fault the facts he has presented or the questions he has raised regarding the impact of technological technical transfer and technical assimilation on the Soviet economic development. His work is indispensable for anyone seeking to comprehend the nature of technological development in the Soviet Union. It deserves the serious attention of all specialists in the field of Soviet studies. Wait a minute. Oh, okay, I just read that. It's a duplicate. Okay. Klaus Meyer. Oh, this is in German. Oh, yeah, I can't read that. All right. Another one in German. Well, he got reviews from Germany and France. That's interesting, for sure. Here we go. Howard J. Sherman, The American Political Science Review, Volume 67, Number 3, September 1973. This is a delightful book for those who like the anachronistic museum pieces breathing the fiery spirit of the Cold War of the 1950s. Sutton's basic hypothesis is that the Soviet economic development from 1917 to 1930 was essentially dependent on Western technological aid. Chapters 2 through 15 of the book are long and tedious discussions of each major industry designed to convince the reader that this is so. Chapter 2 asserts that Caucasus oil fields were totally dependent on Western technological aid for the development of the 1920s. The same assertion is made for the coal and anthracite mining industries, Chapter 3, the metallurgical industries, Chapter 4, the non-ferrous metal mining and smelting industries, Chapter 5, gold mining, platinum, and asbestos, Chapter 6, agriculture, Chapter 7, fishing, hunting, and canning, Chapter 8, lumbering, Chapter 9, machine building, Chapter 10, electricity and electrical equipment, Chapter 11, chemical gas and dye industries, Chapter 12, food, clothing, and housing and industries, Chapter 13, transportation and transport equipment, Chapter 14, and military production, Chapter 15. There is very little pretense of objectivity in this polemic, although a great deal of evidence is presented. None of it is comprehensive, and all of it falls into the category of casual empiricism. Sutton's main source of data are the U.S. State Department, the German Foreign Ministry, and Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Is this 19? Okay. And an economic analysis by Scotland Yard. Before I keep reading, one thing that is really frustrating me with all these reviews is most of them fail to admit that he used Soviet sources. Anybody who watched my episode 35 knows that he used not only Soviet official documents like Pravda, but also reports from the Politburo and Soviet observers in the West. So that's there. I read almost all of Volume 1 like 10 years ago. So this idea that some of these authors are creating that he's not using Soviet sources is completely unfounded. And it must also be noted that Sutton has peculiar use of aid concepts since the capitalist governments all did their best to prevent any trade of any sort with the Soviet Union in the early years, and only the greed of individual capitalists broke through the barrier. This aid, therefore, is not gifts to the Soviet Union, but very carefully drawn commercial agreements paid for by precious foreign currency. Of course, the Soviet Union was a backward country before the revolution and did borrow much technology from the West. Mostly bought and paid for through the nose, but Sutton goes much further, pushing the point in an exaggerated rhetoric. The Western contribution to Soviet production between 1917 and 30 was total. No important process has ever been isolated which was not West to East transfer. Of course, where else would they have found the technology in those days? The trouble is that Sutton implies from the truism that the main effort to rebuild and expand the Soviet economy came from Western capitalists rather than the Soviet people. One should rather emphasize that the sacrifices were bitter and hard to take, beginning with the vast amount of agricultural produce that had to be exported to pay for Western machinery and technology, and ending with the Stalinist dictatorship that enforced these sacrifices. One thing to add to here is it's really amazing just how many Soviet shills there were in the 70s. Like, these are all, like, American sources. Like, oh, yeah, like, trust Lenin. The ghost of Lenin, I guess, is, behind all this. It's very interesting that there were so many Soviet shills. In order to show that the Bolsheviks and the Soviet people did nothing and foreigners did everything, Sutton totally rewrites history in several other cases. First, he argues that Tsarist Russia wasn't so bad and that it was really quite developed economically. Okay, first of all, he makes no claims about the social conditions in Tsarist Russia. Sutton talks about the economic development, specifically with the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Yet this was a country that almost all the characteristics we currently associate with underdeveloped countries. More than 80% of the population was rural and agricultural and illiterate. Most of the small amount of modern industry was owned and run by foreigners, and the transportation network was tiny and inefficient. Second, Sutton admits that most experts had always thought that the collapse of the Russian industry in 1917 and 1922 was due to World War I. The effect of two revolutions, many peasant uprisings, the anti-Bolshevik military intervention by 14 foreign capitalist powers, including the United States in the Civil War, fought by all the forces of the counter-revolution. See Howard Sherman, The Soviet Economy, Boston, Little Brown, 1969, Chapter 3. But he airily dismisses these minor dislocations. Instead, he claims the basic cause for the collapse was the economic illiteracy of the ideology, which had neglected to think out its economic counterpart, and drove a viable growing economy into shambles. Thus, he finds that socialism caused this catastrophic decline, while foreign capitalists produced the recovery. There we go. There we go. That's why this guy's upset. So, no, it's obviously socialism, guys. Trust me, it's socialism. One might wonder, though, just what kind of viable growing economy could exist in the midst of a world war, two revolutions, a civil war, and foreign intervention, even assuming the best possible economic ideology. Well, this is an utterly specious thing to say. Look at all the military developments and innovations the mid-20th century Germans made. Actually, in both World Wars. In the First World War, the Germans invented the submachine gun, the monoplane, poison gas, the leaching nitrates from the air, which was later then put into agricultural purposes. All of which, essentially the whole world, the entire global economy was arrayed against them by England and later the United States. In World War II, they invented jets, wire-guided missiles, active night vision equipment that sucked in the light from basically infrared projectors, and all sorts of things. I mean, this is like, the German position in the two world wars was as bad, if not worse, than what Russia was dealing with in 1920. So I don't really want to hear this. This is just a joke. In emphasizing the importance of Western benevolence, he does modestly admit that technology is not the only factor in economic development. Political, social, and psychological factors play their respective roles. This interplay is particularly interesting in the Soviet example, but is unfortunately outside the scope of this study, since he doesn't hesitate to make broad generalizations about many political events. This is a strange modesty. It simply gives him an out from considering the main trouble with his thesis. Soviet industrialization involved not only the importation of a minor amount of foreign machinery and technology, it also involved a major change of the society from capitalism to socialism and planning. Many other underdeveloped countries have received large amounts of foreign investment and large amounts of free aid in the half-century since the Soviet Union began its industrialization. Why have none of these been successful? Why are India and Pakistan and Africa and Latin America still at abysmally low levels while the Soviet Union is the world's second industrial power? Well, that's also a specious question. After World War II, German factories from East Germany and from Chinese Manchukuo were all sent to Russia. And Germany had some of the most highly advanced industry in the world, producing jets and V-2 rockets. And they used, we hear a lot about the U.S. Operation Paperclip, using a lot of these NS scientists. The Soviets did the same thing. And again, this is 1973, I think, 69. The Soviets never caught up to U.S. aerospace. Why is that? The U.S. aerospace was always more advanced than the Russians. Better flight, better G-suits, better radar, better gun control, for our radar-guided guns, and more advanced missiles. So, I think this is a butthurt socialist who doesn't like. Notice he also doesn't argue with the facts of the matter. He takes a very tedious opposition to his reading. And again, remember, this was a bold claim that Sutton made at the time. One which I believe has since been validated by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So keep that in mind. Let's see. Does this have something to do with the difference between capitalism and socialism? How did this one underdeveloped country achieve success with only minor foreign imports, whereas others have so far failed, with major foreign imports including free? Not only was the Soviet Union socialist economically, but there's also the fact, which Sutton clearly doesn't like, that it confiscated foreign capital, whereas all the others allowed continued imperialist domination. In addition to the major thesis of the book, several other aspects reveal the author's bias. as if this article doesn't reveal the current author's bias, but okay. At several points in the book, Sutton seems to imply that it is a bad thing that the United States ever decided to allow any trade with the Soviet Union, and he hints at support for U.S. government restrictions on Soviet trade. Second, and closely related, he slanders all the American capitalists who participated in the early trade agreements with the USSR. Interesting. Where's the basis for this? Thus, it turns out on the sole basis of the State Department files that Charles H. Smith was more or less a Soviet agent, as was Julius Hammer and Ludwig Martens and several others who wanted trade with the Soviet Union. It sounds more like a CIA fairy tale than a scholarly study. Finally, based, again, mainly on unbiased State Department files, he convicts most of the Soviet leaders of personal corruption in relation to the foreign concessions, including here slanderous attacks on Trotsky, Zinoviev, Chicherin, and Dzerzhinsky. Wow, slandering Trotsky and Dzerzhinsky. Imagine my shock. I mean, this guy is such an obvious shill. It's just like, wow. Defending Trotsky and Dzerzhinsky. Moreover, just to show no bias against Trotsky, he also tosses in an attack on the basis of no evidence whatsoever on the personal corruption of Stalin and all Soviet leadership of later period as well. Oh, of course, because we all know Papa Stalin wasn't corrupt at all. I mean, this is just tedious. Well, we've almost got through all of it. So, everybody, we will pick up next week with more readings. We will hopefully finish 1917 to 1930 and begin reading 1930 to 1945. So let's see what we have in the chat. Crusader 21, good evening. Let's see. Researcher Virgil D. Cyber Ninja Zero of Oklahoma City University reported finding numerous factual errors in the book and claimed that Sutton repeated unsubstantiated allegations, came to unwarranted conclusions. I could post a link, but I need to wrench. Well, that's a problem with all of these. They're behind a paywall. And the one that I got was from a friend. He got all these for me. Okay, let's see. Al Harrison, Michael Collins Piper states that Sutton says in his own writings that he finds it of little effect. Let's see. Jonathan Pohl, Soviet industrialization only really takes off in 1928 with the start of the first 5-year plan. We have a super chat, which I should have read first. Sorry, everyone. Hunger the Dime Marcher for $10 US. Great work with the series. Todd, have you seen McMeenan's Stalin's War? I have not. Also unrelated, but your talk with Charles Haywood is one of the best tech discussions on YouTube. Major props. Well, thank you. Minoan, agree. The Haywood interviews was tops. Jonathan Pohl, Todd should also read The Years of Great Silence. Yeah. I should check that out. So much salt you can make a pool to an open ocean. Yeah. And the other thing that's relevant here is there has been no plausible account given of how the Soviet Union capitalized and developed on its own, which again is the problem we still get today, which is ridiculous because the technical transfers to China, which we've seen since the 1980s, were not even hidden. They were open and public. So there's that. One other thing I would like to add before is, let's see, from Sutton's first work, he talks about his methodology. The idea that he wasn't using Soviet sources is ridiculous. I am going to look this up and end with this. Yeah. Come on, we'll get there. Or maybe it was the end of his book. Right, it's the end of his book, The Methodology of the Study. I will share that on the screen. Stop. Share screen. There we go. Methodology of the study. A simple but consistent methodology is utilized in the study. Our objective is to estimate in a quantitative manner the impact of Western technology on early Soviet economic development. Each plant in this fairly primitive economy is identified, and the origin of its equipment and technical process is traced. Because many of the plants were operated by Western concession operations, the major research task has been to obtain extensive and accurate data on concession operations. This was a complex and time-consuming task involving a search and source originating in a dozen countries. The data generally comes from one of 5 sources, distinguished by varying degrees of reliability. This variety, however, allows for comparison and informed interpretation of data from different sources on many similar problems. The primary source of data are the United States State Department decimal file and German Foreign Ministry files from 1917 to 30. These are superlative sources of detail not available everywhere. Yet, a few concessions were not recorded by these respective home governments. I'm not going to read all of that. I'm just going to read the highlights. The second source of data is Western news and media, and in general consists of voluntary information releases from these companies desiring to publicize their operations. During the 1920s, fear of public opinion curbed news concerning these concessions of many companies. Third source of data, and a surprisingly lucrative source, consists of publications of Soviet trade representatives in Western countries. These sources have been treated with the same circumspection as data originating within the Soviet Union. However, it has been found that the data from this source usually agrees with the news media reports, with specific exceptions noted in the text. A fourth source consists of data originating within the USSR, particularly in Pravda, Izvestia, and I'm not going to say that last one. A series of 5 maps dated 1921 suggests the vast plans involving thousands of predicted concessions, which characterize early Soviet thinking. And then there's a fifth one. The fifth source consists of a collection of miscellaneous material in several languages, including books written by engineers, consultants, and others who worked in the USSR, and statistical summaries and handbooks published by Soviet representatives abroad. All right, everyone. That is it for tonight. And tune in next Tuesday, where we'll hopefully finish the concessions for 1917 to 30, and then begin the reviews for the concessions of 1930 to 45. And again, after the show is uploaded, I will add a link to my Google Drives where you can find all these articles without having to go through the paywall. So, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.